Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a wonderful book I just finished reading. It's called The Story of the World, History for the Classical Child. This is the revised edition of Volume 1. This covers ancient times, so the subline there says from the earliest nomads to the last Roman emperor. And as you can see, it is written by Susan Wise Bauer. There's also a great audiobook version of this read by Jim Weiss that our family has used quite a bit. So let me say a little bit about this book and what it is, what it's doing, and then I'll share some of my thoughts. So this is, as you can tell, a history book for kids, and it's history book that is something you can use if you're homeschooling or even in a Christian school setting or something like that, to help orient your students or your kids to the story of the world. And it's doing that kind of broadly within the camp of classical Christian education. Although, of course, once you get into that camp, you quickly find out there's a lot of debate, discussion about what exactly does that mean? What does it include? What does it not include? All of those types of things. But Susan Wise Bauer is trying to boil the history of the world down to a digestible but exciting and accessible form, and trying to give kids something that will spark their interest in history, orient them to the story of the world as a whole, with Western history in particular kind of having a prominent place, and lay a foundation for later learning and development. So this book is the first of 4 books. There's a 4-part series. This book, the first volume, was published in 2001, and then the revised edition came out in 2006, and the rest of the books have kind of been published since then. So this is oriented for sort of elementary school age. You could use it up into middle school probably, but definitely kind of pre-high school, is the vantage point. Although, I just sat down and read this myself, and really enjoyed it. So I think one of the virtues of it is it's accessible to kids, but it's not oriented only towards kids. You could be older and still get a lot out of this. In fact, my wife has commented, frequently when we'll kind of hear our kids listening to the audiobook version of this set, oh, I never heard that story, or no one ever told me these things. So I think even as an adult, you'll learn a lot about the history of the world. So what does she cover in this book, and what's kind of her approach? Well, each chapter is fairly short, usually about 10 or 15 pages. You could sit down and read a whole chapter in one go, 15, 20 minutes probably. And it covers, again, from the earliest nomads down through the last Roman emperor. So there's quite a bit of world history crammed into these pages. But she does a really good job of guiding people through that. And one of the things I really like is how she actually starts the book. She does a great job of kind of orienting kids to history and to archaeology and to, sources, all those kinds of things that you cover in like a historiography class. She's communicating in these first chapters, but in a way that's very dynamic through stories and sort of situations and scenarios, illustrations, all this kind of stuff. She's an educator herself, she's a mom, and you can tell she's leaning on and drawing on all of those skills to write something that makes sense to kids and helps parents learn how to teach and communicate these things. So as I was reading this book, as someone who loves teaching, I really enjoyed it, both because I was learning about the history of the world, but also I felt like I was learning how to teach better and how to teach history better. So that was really, really fascinating. And anyone who teaches history or really has the opportunity to teach anything could probably learn something from the way she communicates this to children. But then she sort of walks through the story of the ancient Egyptians, the story of the ancient Sumerians, the story of the Hebrew people, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, on through kind of the normal storyline of the ancient Near East and the ancient world. But one of the things I like about the book is that it really is a story of the world. So you sometimes get this debate, I think it was a big thing in the 90s and things, with sort of revisionist history and multiculturalism. There was sometimes this sort of tug of war between, should we teach Western history, Western civilization, or should we teach world history, sort of global history? And that was often kind of this tug of war, and that that whole debate and discussion sometimes stood in as a proxy for other debates and discussions. But I think what Susan Wise Bauer has done is to kind of thread the needle and show that you don't have to make this, that's sort of a false choice. Because what she does in this book is to present something that's very much sort of history for the classical child, as she says. It fits very much within that classical and even classical Christian education, although I'll say more about the Christian piece in a moment. But she fits very much within that classical realm. Sorry for the cut there. I had a child calling to ask if she could get up from her nap. So what Susan Wise Bauer does is, on the one hand, to give you something that feels a lot like a Western Civ book. It's walking through Western history, paying a lot of attention to the Greco-Roman world, paying a lot of attention to the development of the biblical and Christian story. And so in that sense, someone coming from that kind of classical education, Western Civ vantage point is going to say, yeah, this is a great resource. But she also will walk through the history of ancient China or Japan, or what's going on with the Aborigines in Australia, or what's going on with American Indian tribes in the New World. So she has an eye to these global cultures and civilizations, and will often help to connect those things. Say, hey, this story that we're learning about with the Qin dynasty is happening at the same time as this thing that's happening over in Egypt or ancient Rome, or whatever it might be. So she does a great job of kind of giving you that global perspective, and she weaves in as well kind of geography to that. Of course, geography and history are inseparable, but she'll talk about, okay, we've been talking about the history of Egypt. Now, if you put your finger on the globe or a map and take it to the right over here and then go down, you'll find, ancient Australia, that kind of thing. So she does a great job of trying to put all these pieces out there from all these different civilizations, but also connect them together, reference them with one another, so that kids are building that understanding of what's going on in the story of the world. But I think she's also wise to realize you can't tell all stories equally. So the emphasis, I would say, is more on the kind of standard Western Civ side of things, which I think is valuable. I think if you're teaching kids, in English and in America or in Western Europe, you want to know your own story first and well before you learn the stories of others. And it's also important that the story of Western culture and civilization continues to have a tremendous impact on the shape of the world. And of course, if you're a Christian, the Greco-Roman world is not just interesting culturally, it's the context within which the New Testament is going to come. And the ancient Near Eastern cultures of Egypt and Babylon and Assyria, you need to understand what's going on there to understand the Old Testament as well. So I think there's an argument from a couple of vantage points. So one is just sort of a cultural, you need to know your own story best and first, not only, but best and first, kind of foundationally. Secondly, I think for anyone, no matter where you're from, Western culture and civilization has exerted a tremendous impact, often good, sometimes bad. So to understand that story and those implications is very important, just to navigate life in the modern world. And then thirdly, I would say, as a Christian, there's a particular impetus to understand Western history well, because that's the context for the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then the later development of church history. So I don't think it's wrong. In fact, I think it's wise to kind of put the emphasis or accent there, particularly if you're being taught in the Western world. However, I think it's a huge mistake to limit our history to that kind of storyline or pathway, and to ignore the fascinating stories and incredible insights of all these different cultures. So you need to know something about ancient India, ancient China, ancient Japan, ancient Korea, the Aborigines, the American Indian tribes, what's going on in Africa. All of these things are fascinating, they're important, they're significant, and sometimes things that you and if you pay attention to those stories, you'll get a lot of cool insights that you would miss otherwise. So she does a great job of kind of giving that balance between the Western Civ and the world history kind of approach. So I really, really like that. I like the fact that she does a good job of teaching about kind of the discipline of history, teaching about geography, and she's also weaving into that some of the stories, some of the myths from these ancient cultures. You'll learn about some of the African folk tales. You'll learn about stories from the Bible, from the Old Testament in particular in this volume, right? And the birth of Christ as well in the New Testament. So she does span into the New Testament as well. I forgot about that. And but she'll also talk about where Buddhism comes from and Confucianism, and so you're getting that orientation to different worldviews, different mythologies, different stories, and that helps you just to kind of get a bit more of the flavor of the culture. So she does a great job of, again, making this a story and not just sort of disconnected facts. So it's really interesting. I really, really enjoyed this book. Some people, I'll just kind of at this point mention, some people critique this book because they feel like it's too Christian. Susan Wise Bauer is a Christian herself. In fact, she has a seminary degree from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. And some people feel like she gives too much credence to the testimony of the Bible. Ironically, though, other people will critique it and say it's not Christian enough because she doesn't sort of come right out and say the Bible is the one true story and these other ones are false religions. She's more describing than she is assessing some of those things. Personally, I feel like what she does is good for what it's doing, which is trying to introduce you to the story of the world, trying to orient you to different cultures and religions, and allowing the Bible to speak for itself, rather than her sort of stepping in as a preacher or teacher to expound or apply it. Part of why I'm comfortable with that is because, like in our homeschooling situation, for example, we have our own catechetical family worship teaching that's part and parcel of this. So I'm not looking for, this book to be the heavy lifter on teaching the Bible or teaching Christian theology. There are far better resources for that. And in fact, I think if this book tried to do that, it would become unwieldy and probably, it probably wouldn't do a good job of being both a good historical book and a good catechetical or theology book. So I like the fact that it gives respect to the scriptures, that it doesn't cast aspersions on the scriptures or sort of say, oh, this is just a myth or a story. But I also am fine with the fact that it's not sort of taking those further steps of saying, hey, here's how you think about X, Y, and Z, because there's other resources that do that better, and I think parents are the right ones to have those conversations with their kids. So just be aware of that. Again, some people feel like, oh, it's too Christian. Others feel like it's not Christian enough. I feel like it's a good resource for what it's doing. It's not the only thing I'd have in my homeschool, but it's definitely a good resource. So let me just say a word about how we have used this book and then how others might use this book. So we have used this kind of informally. We have the audiobook version of the first 3 volumes of this book, and we just let our kids listen to those constantly. So our kids every day are listening to audiobooks, and oftentimes, so they don't even think about it as school, which is fun. They'll just ask to listen to Story of the World, and they'll sit and they'll color or they'll draw or they'll paint, and they'll just listen for hours to these stories from history, and they listen to them over and over and over again. So if we were to say, hey, here's this curriculum you need to work through, they'd probably fight against it, but they don't know that it's school, so they just love it. Little hack there. If you have the opportunity to homeschool your kids, you can oftentimes get a lot of schooling in if you just don't call it school. At least at this stage. I realize that becomes difficult at later stages, but with younger kids, they often just enjoy it and soak it up. So they listen to these constantly. They know them really, really well. That's part of why I wanted to sit down and just read through the whole thing myself, so I could get the benefit of that and know what they're listening to as we go. And so they are constantly listening to these things, and we see it, we hear it in the conversation. I was looking at something online, and this statue of Romulus and Remus nursing at this mother wolf came up, and one of my daughters came up and was like, oh, that must be Romulus and Remus, because she's heard the story from Story of the World. Or one of my daughters was talking about, the terracotta soldiers and the Qin dynasty and China, so that it's all, swirling around in their heads. And so often they'll hear something or will read something and it makes a connection. That's what I think is really the strength of this book. It's covering so much ground, and it's doing it in such a kind of kid-friendly way that I think, it needs to be built upon. All of these stories can be expanded. The timeline can become firmer in their head. You are jumping around to different cultures and sometimes different time periods. So it's not sort of building a consecutive story quite as much as other things might do if it was just telling, 1 or 2 stories. But for this age, I think it's fine. It's just sort of getting them exposed to those things, getting them exposed to history, getting a lot of those stories in their mind, and giving a rough chronology. And then there's other resources that will unpack and expand that further. So the way we use it is just to kind of have it on in the background a lot of the time, and our kids are soaking up that history that way. There are more resources that you can use. There's actually like workbooks and curriculum. You could do this in a more structured, this is going to be our history curriculum kind of thing. We take a little less formal approach to that, but that stuff is out there if you want to kind of use it in a more in-depth way. And you can just go to Well Trained Mind Press, and they are the publishers of this, and they've got all those resources there. Again, there's the audiobook version, which I would highly recommend. It's great just to have it on in the background. But so there's lots of ways you can use it, but we have found it very valuable. A lot of people we know have highly recommended it, and I can definitely see why. One last kind of comment. This is volume 1. There are 3 more volumes, so 4 volumes all told, which take you from the earliest nomads all the way up to the 20th century. Susan Wise Bauer does point out, kind of in the introductions to her books, that she starts at kind of the most simple level for the youngest children, and then lets it become a little bit more demanding with each book. So on the one hand, you could kind of drop in at any point, like our girls will listen to volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, but those other volumes are a little bit more demanding, so starting chronologically makes the most sense as their youngest, and then let them kind of build, although there's not huge gaps or leaps. She did point out, though, that the 4th volume is one that's definitely more for older elementary kids. And part of that is just because it's more complex and involved, but the other part of it is a lot of modern history is very dark. You've got to cover things like the Holocaust. You've got to cover the world wars. You've got to cover colonialism and all of these types of things, which often are difficult to explain to kids, and not necessarily things you might want your 5 or 6 or 7-year-old to have to grapple with right off the bat. So just be aware of that. The 4th book is maybe in kind of a different category, so we actually haven't let our girls listen to or read the 4th book yet. They are listening to the first 3, and then as they get a bit older, we'll add the 4th one into the mix. So just something to note on that front. But a really, really wonderful resource. It does have some pictures. It does have some maps and illustrations and things. So not color, not anything super, phenomenal, but a little bit of interest if you're reading it with your kids and they're sitting on your lap. But all of that to say, I really, really love this book. I really love this series, and I would highly recommend if you just want to learn more about the world, or if you're looking for something for maybe a homeschool or a Christian school or a co-op or something, consider checking out Volume 1 of Story of the World by Susan Wise Bauer.